All right. Hello and welcome everyone to our Let's Be Neighbors for our culminating episode of the housing series that we've done. First starting with homelessness and then rent, and now we're on to growth in Utah. And we do have an incredible group of panelists that I'm so excited to present about, which I'll get to in just a minute. As a couple of housekeeping things just before we get started. If you are coming in and viewing, if you have more than one person on your screen, just say and type in the chat how many people are showing, just so we can have a better reflection of how many people are actually watching this and we can make it the best program possible. And then the other big one that's just for you guys to remember is, as participants, is feel free to ask any question at any time. Just put it in the chat at any point throughout the program, and we will dedicate the last half hour, and we will get to as many as possible. And if you ask early, we tend to get to those quicker. It's kind of a first come first served as best we can. We'll kind of group questions if we can, but yeah, type them in freely throughout the series or the presentations. Thank you. And yeah, but without further ado, we're going to get started. And I would like to introduce our group of panelists. We have Dina Blaes, and she is the Director of Regional Development for the entirety of Salt Lake County. And we are so happy to have her because she really has a pulse of what's happening in Salt Lake County right now. And also we have R.A. Bruning, and he is the Chief Executive Officer of Envision Utah. And his group works with so many partnerships, and they cover the scope of growth as a comprehensive whole. And they really do know what's going on in all these different pockets and basically how to make Utah thrive in the long run. They've done studies, they've done a lot of expansive research, and they know their stuff. And so we are really lucky to have him as well. And we are also really lucky to have Mallory Bateman. She is the Director of Demographic Research for the Gardner Policy Institute at the University of Utah. And they do extensive studies on demographics of the trends of things that have happened, what's going to happen. There's been recent news articles reported on what's going to be Utah's going to look like projected in the next, I think, 50 years. And that's directly from their research and studies. And so we are so lucky to have this entire group here. I will segue perfectly over to them because they are the stars and I want to spotlight them as much as possible. So we will start with Mallory and go from there. So take it away, Mallory.
Thank you for that kind introduction, and hopefully I can share some information that will be useful for everyone. So I'm gonna try to share my screen. We'll see how this goes. Okay, come on, bar. There we go. Okay, is it showing up okay now? Okay, so thanks for your time. I am, as Heather said, I am over at the Gardner Policy Institute. We're part of the David Eccles School of Business at the University of Utah, if you want a real big mouthful of language. And I'm going to talk about what Utah has looked like, what our growth and change has looked like, and then looking into the future, what we might be dealing with what we know now. So looking back, if we look at the recent census data, if you remember 2 years ago, getting your notice in the mail that you should go online and fill out the form, it's a once a decade opportunity to count everybody living in the United States only once, and in the right place. So it's a pretty extensive effort. And with that effort, we found that Utah was the fastest growing state in the nation. We added just over 500,000 new residents, and that was about 18.4%. You can see in our region as a whole, we had a lot of growth. That's not necessarily the case throughout the entire United States. You can see kind of over in the Midwest, South, and the East, you have some different pictures of growth. Those yellow shades are lower growth areas or decline. And so, you know, we got to hold on to number one. I'll throw out that 18.4% is actually a little bit lower than the previous decade and a little bit lower than 2 decades ago. So we've been dealing with extensive growth for quite some time, but it's kind of taking a step back each decade. This illustrates that pretty well. So the red line shows our population and the yellow stars indicate when we hit millions. And so you can see it took us until 1966 to hit our first million people. We hit 2 million around 1995, and you can see the trajectory of the line kind of gets a bit steeper starting in the 90s. And then in 2015, we hit 3 million people. And so some changing elements of our growth help drive that, and we'll talk about those a bit more. But just know that growing and changing is something that has always happened in Utah. You can see on this chart, 1890, we weren't even technically a state, but this is the first time the footprint of our state was counted in a decennial census. So we've always grown, we've always had some change, and that's kind of a funny thing to be a regular part of who we are as a state. This is showing the 2020 census numbers at the county level. And I know that we're focused in Salt Lake County, and that was around 1.2 million residents, but wanted to show the whole picture to show that the whole state experienced has very different population dynamics going on. So about 75% of our population in Utah lives along the Wasatch Front. So that's the 4 counties of Davis, Weber, Salt Lake, and Utah. So just thinking about, we've got over 3 million residents in our little corridor that you can go up and down in about 2 hours. Then you have Cache County and Washington County that add another 10%. So about 85% of our population in Utah is living in those 6 counties. You can see, throughout the middle of the state, the eastern part of the state, some pretty different numbers. Daggett County actually lost a little population between 2010 and 2020. They're under 1,000 in that 2020 census count. So pretty different than the 1.2 million we have in Salt Lake County. So again, I'm using the stars because I think they're fun, but this is showing the changes, the fastest growing communities in Utah. And if you are familiar with these community names, you know that they are largely in southern Salt Lake County and northern Utah County. So the stars are indicating our southern Salt Lake County communities, but the blue area is showing the 2010 census population, and then the red outline indicates the 2020 census population. So we have 5 different communities where their population more than doubled. Vineyard down in Utah County is a very special case, going from a very small farming community and then having a big planned development to really change what their population looks like. But you can see that really intense growth kind of really localized within that Wasatch Front area. Also wanted to call out just some other communities in Salt Lake County, because despite not growing at wild rates, still gained quite a few new residents. Our kind of more established communities, if you will, have been around a bit longer, still grew, but not, doubling, tripling population like those kind of newer communities where there might be more actual room to grow in a more, not an infill way. And maybe we'll talk about that in a bit more, but just changing kind of what that growth looks like. Also in our larger communities, you have to add a lot more people to get those percentages. So 7% in Salt Lake City is very different than 7% in a place like Bluffdale, people-wise. It's thousands of people different. So just something to keep in mind as we kind of think about this growth and what it looks like overall throughout the county. Another aspect, so we're kind of limited in what we have from the 2020 census data. I'll throw that out. We have the redistricting data, which is used for political boundaries, but then we like to look at it because it's our first glance at the city and the county level, and provides the race and ethnicity makeup using those Census Bureau Office of Management and Budget categories. So looking at our growth, that 500,000 new residents, over half of that population identified outside of non-Hispanic white. So we're seeing more racial and ethnic diversity in the state than previous decades. And the blue chart here is just kind of breaking out that 52% into those categories. I'll add the caveat that these categories have their limitations. This is a way to account for the population without double counting anybody. I'm working right now on a paper to kind of dive into these categories a bit more and provide a little bit more commentary. But we know that this is not necessarily representative of everyone's lived experience, these categories. So in Salt Lake County, breaking down those changes, we have now 1 in 3 residents in the county identifying as a race or ethnicity other than white. In the state, that's 1 in 4 people. And again, if we had a county map, we've got some very different pictures in the different counties. Salt Lake County really racially and ethnically diverse. San Juan County looks pretty different than other counties due to the large American Indian and population down in that part of the state. But you can see here, using those categories again, these reflect for the race category, the non-Hispanic members of the race. Hispanic or Latino population can choose any race on the form, but then we'd be double counting people. So just know, again, we're working within the confines in the best way we can, but just showing our Hispanic and Latino population is about 1 in 5 Salt Lake County residents. Our Asian population has been growing quite a bit and grew again throughout this decade. And then you see that 2 or more races or some other race, and that growing in a somewhat significant way as a share. And that was seen nationally as well. Also wanted to call out just our communities in Salt Lake County, and this is part of why we've got a very different dynamic than other parts of the state. West Valley City is and Kearns are our 2 communities that are minority majority, for lack of, or majority minority, you know what I'm trying to say. It's not just the majority of population identifying as non-Hispanic white. So we've got some really racially and ethnically diverse communities in Salt Lake County, and it's a different dynamic than what we see in other communities throughout the state. So talk about what makes our population change really quickly. So this chart is showing our 2 kind of main factors of growth when we're thinking about it demographically. So net migration is the gray area on this chart. And if it falls below that 0 line, that means more people moved out than in. If it's above, that means more people moved in than out. And so you can see that since the 90s, when we had that kind of steeper trajectory on our growth line, a more solid influence of net migration, so more people moving in than moving out, has had a big impact on our population. The red dotted line is natural increase, and that's births minus deaths. And that, I think, is what people typically think of when they think of Utah and growing. But you can see since 2008, that line has kind of started to slope downward. We'll talk about that in a minute. And then the black line overall shows how those 2 combine to result in our population change. And so you can see, you know, we've got that kind of stable natural increase and that kind of wild net migration. And that net migration makes a big impact on what our growth or change looks like each year. So total fertility rates are a measure to look at births per woman that she could expect to have throughout her lifetime. And the red line here is Utah, gray line is the US, and the dotted line is replacement rate. So if all other factors were held constant, the amount of kids you would need to keep the population where it is. You can see that in the US, that rate has been below replacement rate for, you know, since the mid 2000s. And in Utah, we've kind of followed the overall trajectory of that US rate, but we've been higher. And we're still the youngest state in the nation. However, our birth patterns are changing. Now the new data came out in February, so we're pretty excited to finally get the 2020 data, but it indicated that we can expect a woman of childbearing age could expect to have 1.91 children in her lifetime, compared to, you know, if you look back to the early 2000s, it's something like over 2.5. I know that we don't have, you know, fractions of kids, but when we're thinking in this term, we used to be number 1 in this measure, having the highest total fertility rate in the nation. We're now number 4 behind the Dakotas, and Nebraska, I believe, is the other one. It was a new one that popped in this time, but it also results in fewer births overall. And so that impacts the birth side of our growth picture. As I mentioned, we're the youngest state in the nation. There's new data coming out on Thursday. The end dot is going to change slightly from the American Community Survey, but we're younger than everywhere else in the United States. Again, we're the red dots. Sorry, University of Utah. Sometimes we bias our representation. But we're younger than the US, but we're also following that upward trajectory that you can see nationally. If you looked at the counties, again, lots of differentiation. A Daggett County, our small county with the 980 some odd people, their median age is in the 40s. Or Cache County, it's in I think it's around 27. Salt Lake County is pretty near our state median age. Part of that is because we're such a population center, we're going to make a big impact on what the statewide number is. But with an older population, you kind of have the inevitability of an older population means more deaths. And so if there's more deaths and fewer births, that natural increase measure is really going to be impacted in our growth picture. So looking forward a little bit, this is using our new projections data. Again, that same color coding. So the gray area is net migration, the red line is natural increase, and then the black overall line is growth. We actually project that net migration is going to become the dominant driver of growth in the 2040s, considering what we know now with those reduced birth rates, increased life expectancy, and then the increased continued diversification of our economy. We don't really see the economic picture stopping. You know, we're going to see more jobs, we're going to see more types of jobs, and those are likely going to attract people to the state. So, you know, that might be one of the points of our conversation moving forward. What keeps drawing people here, but that makes a big impact on our growth into the future. Similarly, similar picture in Salt Lake County, but you can see that influence of net migration compared to natural increase happening quite a bit earlier. You know, within this decade, we kind of anticipate that to happen. Part of that is Southern Salt Lake County, that really intense growth area, has a little bit larger families, more births, that kind of thing. But then in the other more established communities, you do have older populations. You have some more of that aging population that's going to impact both sides of natural increase. We are kind of the economic center of the state. We can see that continuing in our projections. And so that's another thing to consider. There will continue, at least with our set of assumptions we're working under, we see continued growth of the economy, bringing people here, being an attractive place for people to live. And so that impacts that net migration picture. So putting all of these factors together, we see an increase of 1.3 million Utahns by 2060. This is a slightly more moderated narrative than what has come out with previous rounds of projections. I know that we all like to, well, I don't know if we like to, the kind of soundbite that's common is Utah's population is going to double by this time. And we've kind of pulled that back with our new, what we know with births. They've followed a slightly more, not intense decline, but they've declined more than we anticipated in the round of projections we produced in 2017. So there's some things like that where we've got more data points. We can see a little bit better picture of the recent past to then look forward into the future. Again, you can see that moderated growth rate kind of following what's been happening for the past couple decades, but putting our population in 2060 statewide around 5.5 million people. Salt Lake County, see a similar growth trajectory, kind of following that pattern with all these factors considered, and the addition of, you know, over 480,000 residents. So we do anticipate more growth in the region. We do think that that's going to continue as we move forward. Again, we build these projections with sets of assumptions. If there was something wild to happen, that could impact what this growth picture looks like. I will throw out, since we did experience, or currently still experiencing something wild, there is a consideration of COVID related deaths in our mortality side of the model, but it's a short-term impact. So that might be something that we pay attention to in the next round of this projections process. We get to revisit these every 4 years. As we get new data, it's pretty important to update our numbers so that we can plan ahead. I'll kind of start wrapping up by talking again about the racial and ethnic diversity. These numbers are all based off of our previous round of projections, and we hope to redo these in the next year or two with our new data, but showing similar to, you know, a couple of those other trends we've seen. Utah following the national trend in a Utah way, a little bit different, but having kind of a similar thing going on with increasing racial and ethnic diversity. The 4-line chart shows the 2010 populations for both Utah and the US. Those are the darker shades. And then the more muted shades, pastel shades, show the projected population in 2060. And this is minority share of population by age group. So starting in the center of the youngest, going out to the oldest on the right side of the axis. And so you can see that our younger population is more racially and ethnically diverse, and we anticipate that that will continue into the future. If we're fortunate enough that, you know, these kids can stay here and continue to grow up and make a life here, if they want to have their own families, that will add to additional racial and ethnic diversity moving forward. So I kind of like to wrap up by thinking about, you know, things change, but things stay the same. And I know change can be scary and uncomfortable, but I think that we have the ability, we've done it numerous times, to kind of work with what we had and maybe improve or change. You can see this older picture in the center of Main Street and 4th South in Salt Lake City. You can see some streetcar tracks there. We maybe have a slightly different iteration of those, but a lot of these buildings haven't changed much. And if we're looking a little bit farther north on Main Street, there's our new version of the streetcar. There's our tracks train, a little bit faster, I'm thinking, a little bit more connections, you know, more people, more types of people, more views to help us kind of grow in our communities. So let's just know that that growth and change is a constant in Utah, but it shouldn't make us super uncomfortable, at least the people side of things. And so with that, I just thank you for your time. I'll throw out, if you ever do have questions about Census Bureau programs or products or anything coming out of the Gardner Institute, reach out to me and let me know. Part of my job is making sure people know what we're talking about. So do reach out if you have questions. And with that, I will wrap up and hand it back over to Heather.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mallory. That was a lot of really good information. And I, for one, am really glad that we're recording this so I can go back through and process that all, because it was awesome. And again, yeah, feel free to write out any questions in the chat as they come up, and we'll get to those at the end. But Mallory also gave her contact information, which is awesome and generous, and we are thrilled for that. So we'll go straight over to Ari, who is from Envision, Utah, and he is going to talk about growth in Utah in a comprehensive sort of way and basically how to help us thrive. So take it away, Ari.
All right, thank you. Let's see if I can successfully share my screen now. Mallory showed us how to do it. Let's see if I can follow in her footsteps. All right, are we seeing it? Perfect. Okay, so first I wanted to give a little introduction to Envision Utah. In 1997 is when we were born. We saw Mallory's lines in the 90s. That's when growth really started to take off in Utah. And that's why Envision Utah was born. The idea was to bring people together in a nonpartisan, voluntary way to think about growth and where it's going to take us, engage the community, and see if we can't all come to some sort of agreement as to what we want to be when we grow up and how to retain our quality of life. So that's the idea. We are a nonprofit. We've been at this for 25 years now. And throughout that process, we've learned a lot of things. And I'll tell you, one of the number one questions I always get is, why don't we just stop growing? I mean, we all see the impacts of growth. We see, you know, you get stuck in traffic. We're seeing housing prices go through the roof, air quality issues, whatever it is. You know, there are a lot of challenges that come with growth. And why don't we just stop? Well, it's not that easy. Why do we grow? We grow because we're a great place to live. We have a high quality of life. We have a really prosperous economy. Those are good things. We want those things. And you can't really have those things without growing, because that means your kids want to stay. That means other people want to come join you. And it's just, that is the reality of being a great place to live. And it brings a lot of challenges, but I'd rather have those challenges than the challenges of a place that is not a great place to live. So, so really the more relevant question isn't how do we stop growing, but how do we retain a high quality of life even as we grow? Things are going to change for sure, but there are things we love about Utah, and we want to keep those things even as we continue to grow, have a larger population. So I wanted to start, hit a few topics here. And first one I wanted to hit was housing, because I think we're all seeing, as far as impacts of growth, that's got to be number one right now. The data here shows the increase that we've all seen. Even when you adjust for inflation, that's kind of the, well, I don't know what color that is, orange or salmon. Our housing prices have more than doubled since 2011. And if you continue this line into 2022, I think we're now above 500,000 for our median housing price. And we're to the point where I think about 2/3 of Utahns cannot afford the median priced home. So quite concerning. Compare us to other states around the country. On the one hand, you can look at this increase in housing prices and say, oh, this is a problem everybody's got. And that's true. It is a national problem, but it's more pronounced here than almost anywhere else. Idaho, I think, leads us, but we're second in terms of housing price increases. And so the question I often get is, what's going on? So I think it's a combination of a lot of things that are happening. Markets are supply and demand. So to try to boil it down, first of all, we have a soaring demand right now. In Utah, we have a huge millennial generation. Mallory can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think percentage-wise, it's the largest in the country. And they are now in their 30s, prime home buying years. And same time, we have a lot of in-migration happening. Some of that might have been prompted by COVID. So that increases the demand as well. We've also been pretty prosperous for a long time. We've had a low unemployment rates, wages are going up. So people are wanting to better their housing situation. We had some stimulus into the economy, which caused people to want to buy housing, but also do home improvement projects, which compete for the same supplies and so forth. So really high demand at the same time that we see constrained supply. Starting all the way back at the Great Recession, when housing was hit really hard, you saw a lot of people leave a lot of the professions that build homes, and builders just pulled back. And then in the beginning of the pandemic as well, builders said, it doesn't look good. I'm not going to start trying to get projects approved and so forth. Pulled back a little. And then what happened was demand soared instead of plummeting like they thought it would. We're seeing supply chain issues, just like everything else in the economy. The prices of lumber and so forth are high. We're seeing labor constraints. It's really hard to get people to plumbers and drywall hangers and framers and so forth. And then in Utah, we also our valleys where most of the jobs are starting to run out of land, which drives up the price of land. So all of these things are just coming together to just cause this increase in housing prices. And then on top, we're going to throw on top of that now increasing interest rates, which make it even more difficult for us. So lots of things happening. Some of these are short term and will work themselves out. Others are longer term and are going to be challenges going forward. So what do we do about all this?
I'm going to pop in and just say you're in presenter mode and you're not seeing full screen. It's okay, but just letting you know.
Not seeing full screen. Oh, should we see if we can fix that?
You were on such a roll, I didn't want to break
I was on such a roll. Let's see. Let's try this again. Is that better?
It looks fantastic.
Oh, awesome. Okay. All right. So what do we do about it? Well, it's supply and demand. We need more housing. That's the simple answer. I don't know that we can really decrease the demand, but we can increase the supply. And specifically, there are certain kinds of housing that we need more of and in certain places. And I want to talk a lot about that. So there are some people the market's just never going to serve. And so we need some subsidized housing for people of lower incomes. We need more of that. That costs tax dollars, costs money. We need more apartments, rental units, and so forth. We need more, I think this in particular, we need a lot more of. We need townhomes, duplexes, threeplexes, fourplexes. And that picture in the bottom right, I took myself in daybreak. It looks like a single family home, but there are 4 units in that building. We need more things like that, where it's a little more affordable for people, but it's still a way to get into ownership. We need accessory dwelling units. So this might be an apartment above the garage or in the basement or in the backyard or whatever it is. We need more of that. That benefits not just the people who live in those units, but also the people who live in the primary unit who can get some income from it. So we need all of these different housing types. And what's interesting is that's actually what we've been building more of since 2007, since the recession started. So if you look at this chart, this is the entire Wasatch Front. And this change would actually be more pronounced if I showed you just Salt Lake County. But the blue line is the percent of our building permits that have been for single family detached units. And historically, we build about 3/4 of our units single family detached on the Wasatch Front. And about 1/4 of them were some sort of attached product, whether that's an apartment or a townhome or something. And when the recession hit, that kind of reversed and got all muddled up. And since then, we've been building more than half of our units attached product. That's where the market is. That's what people can afford. To some extent, there's a little bit of a change in preference. That's what people want. They don't want that big yard that they have to maintain, but it's more affordability that's happening. So we need to continue that, do more of that. In addition to our single family homes, need to get a little bit smaller in some cases, smaller yards, closer together, those kinds of things. That helps with affordability. Helps with some other things too that I'm going to talk about in a minute. And we need homes that are just smaller. If you look at this chart, this shows you the square feet per occupant in the Wasatch Front for new single family units that were built by year built. So in 1970, we built about 605 square feet per occupant. By the year 2010, we were building 1,000 square feet per occupant. So our homes have gotten bigger, and with the affordability constraints we're seeing, I think that's going to have to start reversing itself a little bit. Now, I want to pause right here. We've talked about apartments, we've talked about townhomes, we've talked about small lot single family. If you look at the zoning across the Wasatch Front, the majority of our land is a place where it's illegal to build any of that. Illegal, we have banned it. That's exactly the kind of housing we need more of. So think about that for a minute. Another thing we need more of is we need housing with transit access. When we think about housing affordability, it's not just the rent or the mortgage payment that you need to think about. It's also the transportation cost. Because we put this chart together a few years ago. This has probably changed a little bit, but we spend roughly 1/3 of our income on housing. If you own 2 cars, AAA tells you that's $10,000 a year per car to own that car and operate it on average. So if you own 2 cars, that's $20,000 a year. That, for a lot of families, that's 1/3 of their budget for transportation. So if you can get them within walking distance of a transit stop, and maybe they can shed a car or just drive less, you can save a household a whole bunch of money. So we need more of that. So now, housing and transportation, it's really hard to separate. So I've talked about the kind of housing we need. Well, where it goes has a big impact on how our transportation system works out. So you see the growth, you see the traffic jam on I-15 at 5 o'clock. What do we do about that? Well, again, it comes down to housing and where we build it. So specifically, we need a lot of that housing. We need it close to jobs. We need it close to shopping, and we need it close to good transportation. So public transportation, freeways, highways, and so forth. And the reason for that is then people don't have to drive as far. And that means there are fewer miles driven, there's less traffic, there are fewer emissions, more people can walk, bike, and so forth. I want to unpack this a little bit. So I've been in city council meetings where people, they show up with their pitchforks and their torches and they say, I don't want that high density near me. And, they're afraid that it's going to have a high impact on them. It's going to bring traffic and so forth. And I get where they're coming from. So what they hope they'll get is if they say no to that apartment project or those townhomes or whatever it is, that they'll just have fewer people in their town and there will be less growth, and then they won't see all those impacts. When the reality is the people don't go away. They're going to live somewhere. And so what happens is by denying them the chance to live in that town, they just go farther out. And then you get a bigger development footprint. They have to travel farther. And there's actually a higher impact to that growth if you spread out the same population over a larger area. So people have to drive farther. They have to use more water to water their lawns because their lawns are bigger. Air quality gets worse and so forth. So I think there's this perception that lower density housing equals lower impacts. Well, if you measure it per person, so if you look at the map on the left, that's total impacts from the development footprint. But if you look at the map on the right, that's impacts per person. Actually, in the denser areas, the impacts per person are lower. So again, here's that map showing we just spread out farther and farther. You see a lot of impacts from that. One solution is, let's do some of these housing types that people don't necessarily want next to them always. Let's put them in these key nodes that are strategically located to be near jobs, to be near transportation. And then that shrinks the development footprint for everything, retains more green space around. And it's a win-win for everybody. So what are these nodes? What we like to call these places is centers. So if you think to historically kind of main streets that we used to build, so there's a picture here of Center Street in Logan. These are places where it's highly walkable. You can get around easily without a car or with a car. So it's walkable. It's mixed use. Now, what does mixed use mean? Mixed use means you're going to have housing, but you're also going to have other things. So you're going to have shopping or restaurants or offices, some kind of destination as well, along with the housing. And that puts things closer to people. They can walk. And then you also need access to some regional transportation here for it to work market-wise. And then that walkable design. So now these kinds of places come in, that's too many, come in a lot of different scales. So you can think downtown Salt Lake is a mixed-use center of this kind, very large scale. Sugar House is definitely becoming a center, maybe one scale lower. You can think of 9th and 9th and 15th and 15th. They're also walkable centers at a much smaller scale. So having these kinds of places all around leads to some pretty good outcomes. And I'm going to talk about those outcomes for a minute. We did this modeling in Utah County. I know we're talking about Salt Lake County, but we just finished this modeling and it makes the case pretty well. This project we called Valley Visioning for Utah County. Mallory will probably tell you that in 2050, 2060, Utah County is going to start rivaling Salt Lake County for population, just because their growth rate is so high. So we went through this visioning process with the residents and cities in Utah County, and this is the vision they came up with these different kinds of centers shown on a map. And then we ran this through different kinds of models to see what the impacts of these centers were as compared to just continuing to build like they have over the last 20 years. And this is the reason people decided they wanted to build in this pattern. So you can see the amount of land consumed, same population, that baseline for how they were growing, they were going to consume about 91,000 acres by the year 2050. And then in this vision land use, they consume 51,000 acres. So that's a lot of agricultural land, for example, that doesn't turn into homes. And they accommodate the same population. Water usage goes down significantly because you have more people in these centers where there's not a lot of water use going on. They don't have a lawn that they're watering, or the lawn is smaller. People are better able to get around. They're more likely to have access to something within walking distance, whether it's a park or a school or a front runner station or something. And emissions go down because people aren't driving as much, or as long they're not driving. More of their trips are walking or biking, and when they do drive, it's a shorter trip. And then the last thing we modeled was people save money. These are real savings in terms of mostly just because you're driving less and there's a cost per mile to drive. They're also using less water and saving money that way, as well as the building energy costs. So these centers are a key solution to our growth and keeping things great the way they are today. More affordable, clean air, less water use, and so forth. And it's also a place to put some of these housing types that I talked about without necessarily disrupting existing single-family neighborhoods quite as much. So let's see, one other thing I wanted to talk about. You've got these centers. We also need to think about housing near jobs. And what do I mean by that? Well, Salt Lake County has 46% of the state's jobs. It has 36% of the state's population. So simple math, that means 10% of the state is commuting into Salt Lake County for work. And you think about all the impacts of that. There are a lot of impacts of that in terms of infrastructure costs, air quality, household budgets, and so on. So finding ways to get more housing near those jobs is critical for our future. And it's challenging because there's not a lot of land left in Salt Lake County. Most of it's in that southwest part of the county. Some of it's up in the northwest area. But as we develop that, we need to be very careful in thinking about how we accommodate the kind of housing that we need. Now, one way to look at this is our jobs corridor is actually I-15. If you look at I-15 throughout the Wasatch Front, there are almost 400,000 jobs within 1 mile of I-15. Within 1 mile of I-15, there are only 186,000 households. So that means there's about 100,000 household deficit in order to have enough people to work at those jobs. It means people are commuting in, right? And if we could balance that a little better, we'd have people driving shorter distances or not driving at all. And one way to do that is if we just took the retail land area along I-15. We all know retail's starting to struggle a little bit. We've seen the big box stores that have closed and so forth. We just, between now and 2050, redeveloped 1/4 of that retail land area and added 20 units an acre there. We could make up that household deficit. Add a whole bunch of housing to help meet the demand, make our transportation system work better, and so forth. So lots of food for thought about how we can grow in ways that keep Utah a great place to live. And I just wanted to close with some thoughts about what can you do? So what can you do to help make sure that we grow in great patterns? Well, one thing you can do is you can blow your Tuesday evening listening to us. There are probably a million other things you could do, and it just shows that you're involved and you care. Help others understand these growth realities and the growth pressures, and that we can't just stick our head in the sand and hope it goes away. And then go get involved. Talk to your planning commission, your city councilor. We actually surveyed folks and discovered that the people who are most likely to say, I don't want development near me, are far more likely to show up at city council meetings and voice their views. And we need more of the majority of the population to show up so that city councilors don't get a skewed perception of what people want. And then you can sign up for our newsletter with Envision Utah and watch for invitations to participate in our various efforts. We'll put out surveys and things, and we'd love to hear from you. So I am optimistic that we can accommodate all that growth that Mallory talked about and still keep Utah a great place to live. We've done it for the last 100+ years, and Utah is still a pretty good place. And we can do it, continue to do it. Utah will be different, but it can still be great. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Ari. That was fantastic. And yeah, that was a lot of information also, but it did show realities, but also a very real way of how we can address those things and make it so we thrive. It's fantastic. Thank you. I know we are a little short on time, so I am going to, without further ado at all, I'm going to segue straight over to Dina, and she can talk about Salt Lake County as the Director of Regional Development.
Thanks, Heather. As you said, I'm Dina Blaes. I'm the Director of the Office of Regional Development for Salt Lake County. My portfolio includes actually housing and community development, environmental sustainability, regional planning and transportation, and economic development. My office also manages all the publicly held real estate assets. We don't sort of manage them. Our real estate office does that, but in terms of setting policy and working on the resources that we have to contribute to some of these problems. So we're really busy in this space. So I narrowed this down to just housing. And it was perfect, actually, how Mallory laid out kind of what we're dealing with people. Ari, I appreciate the fact that you've talked about sort of land use and other things. There's so many topics we could spend the full hour and a half talking about. But I want to sort of bring it down to the next level, which is how the county is setting our priorities for a housing affordability. And my arrows aren't working. Oh no. Oh no. Hang on. Oh, there we go. Okay. So first I want to lay out some of the problems. Some of these problems we've already discussed. Rising prices. So affordability problems are impacting centers or impacting renters and homeowners across multi-income levels. And you'll see that the presentation I said is housing affordability, not affordable housing. The county is dealing with affordability issues at all levels of income for families. And so we have to think about that. So we've seen cost increases, rental increases 12% in 2021, and up about 28% year over year in terms of home ownership. And I know, Ari, you mentioned that the median price home was $495,000. Please know that when we did this presentation, which was back in December, that was the case. It was at $495,000. I think it's up to $515,000 now. So that's just incredible that it's happening so quickly. Don't know why this is taking so long. Oh, there we go. Okay, another issue is income challenges. So we talked about wages and what qualifies someone for like what we hear as an 80% of area median income. So I believe, Mallory, you can probably check me if I'm wrong, but I think 80% of the area median income for Salt Lake County is about 87, no, it's higher. It's $93,000, I believe. Will you check me if I'm wrong? You probably have the data there that you can pull up really quickly. My point in telling you that is that as Ari and Mallory both mentioned, we're growing in family size in terms of household formation. We're expanding our economy in a way that's just unbelievable. I mean, I think the surplus revenues have just been astonishing to a lot of government entities. But what I don't think we should forget about is that what's really happening is this disparity between folks who are in kind of essential worker or low wage jobs, they're in the service industry, are not keeping pace. Their incomes are not keeping pace with the housing costs and so forth. So there's this separation that's occurring between what you can afford and what the units are being rented for. And we shouldn't underestimate the problems that that creates for households, because that's not necessarily a housing problem, it's an income problem. It's a job opportunity problem that becomes a real issue when it comes to trying to find housing. Another issue that everyone's been hearing about is construction and supply constraints, the construction supply chain issues, staffing and labor shortages. Ari mentioned this. We just had a gentleman from Ivory Homes, who was part of a panel that we had earlier last week, who mentioned that for Ivory Homes, they've noticed that their lumber packages for a single family home have gone up 161% year over year from last year. So imagine trying to think, if you're buying a house or you're building a house, how are you going to manage that kind of a cost increase without it having real impacts? Another one is the supply constraint. And this is actually some data that we put together that we extrapolated from Mallory's shop. Growth of sort of new construction versus population growth. So it's important to understand that in this graph, it shows that you've got household formation in the kind of the top, the lighter blue. The darker blue is units, housing units that are being constructed and permitted. You'll see that most people would look at this graph and say, well, what are we worried about? There's more units being constructed and permitted starting in 2018. But what people forget about is that we started, like at that point, we were already behind by probably 10 or 12,000 units. So the average household formation in Salt Lake County is about 8,700 households per year are formed. We've been experiencing about 9,400 new permits. But in order for us to close this gap again, we have to build about 1,000 additional units every year for the next 8 years for us to balance this out. So even though these numbers cross in 2018, we haven't made up for years and years of sort of more household formation than we have unit development. So we've got a ways to go. But I just thought it was important to understand this, that this isn't just a COVID problem. It isn't just our economy's booming problem right now. It isn't even a sort of, this is what was happening after 2018. It's real, or 2008. It's really been a problem that we're trying to catch up on. Okay, why is this doing this? Sorry. It sticks. And now I'm probably going to skip ahead like 10 slides. There we go. Okay. So in addition to that, this is what's also really important. Ari talked about we need more housing and we need more housing options and types. One of the supply constraints that we're dealing with is affordable units that are made up of low-income housing tax credit projects. We will start seeing those units expire. And by expire, what I mean is that they go through a period when they're deed restricted for a lower rate of rent, so lower income families can afford to live there. What this graph is showing you is that 29% of all of the affordable units that are built through low-income housing tax credits will expire in the next 8 years. That's that same 8-year trajectory that we need in order to close the gap of the almost 23,000 units that we're already short. So this is a real struggle for us, because as we are trying to build more and more affordable units, if we start losing those units that are affordable for the lowest income individuals, we haven't solved anything with the housing crisis. It will simply get worse. So Salt Lake County has established several priorities for housing affordability. And one is areas of opportunity as a framework for our housing investments. We're going to continue to administer a substantial amount of federal funds that we have to support housing. And then we're seeking additional dollars from ARPA to capitalize our housing trust fund. And we'll talk a little bit about that. So the first is areas of opportunity. The map on the left that you see is a GIS map where we've taken points all throughout Salt Lake County. And we've sort of mapped them and sort of have it like a heat map. So the darker blue is where you see the greatest access to high employment growth areas, licensed childcare facilities, grocery stores that will accept SNAP, UTA stops, public county Wi-Fi access, and public schools. So to us, for the county, when we start talking about where do we put units, where do we put most affordable units, we want to center them within areas that have support services that are necessary to help those households maintain some housing stability and have greater opportunity. So this is what we look at when we're thinking about where would we put money that we have from either the federal government or a housing trust fund when we want to see successful housing projects start. I will tell you that the majority of low-income housing tax credit projects in Salt Lake County are also in what we call qualified census tracts, which are the lower income census tracts. And it makes no sense. We're just sort of putting all of the lowest income families in the census tracts that have the least opportunities for them to develop their skills, have good educational experiences, and seek opportunities for income. So we're trying to shift that focus and put it into what we are calling areas of opportunity, where there's also more likely that these lower income families will be in a mixed income neighborhood and have lots of different experiences and opportunities. In addition to that, like I said, we're going to be continuing to administer federal funds. So Salt Lake County administers community development block grant funds and several others. And one important one that I wanted to mention on this presentation tonight is the Emergency Rental Assistance Program. This is money that's come to Salt Lake County through the federal government to help families who are experiencing job loss or difficulty paying rent due to COVID impacts. So, and I've included the link there. So hopefully that would be available if you know anybody or have networks of people that you want to share that information with. I would hope that you can check in that link. Our Housing Trust Fund, we are actually seeking $20 million to capitalize our Housing Trust Fund with ARPA money. And we really expect to be looking at sort of, for lack of a better term, stop the bleeding. So keeping affordable units that we have now preserved for that housing stock so they don't go away and we're not working at a deficit. We also want to look at what are called naturally occurring affordable units. And that's kind of a industry term for older buildings that haven't really been well maintained. And so the owners of those buildings can't really garner a higher rent because the market won't really support it in the condition that they're in. So we're seeing opportunities to purchase those housing units and rehabilitate them, but deed restrict them so that they continue to be available to homeowners who are lower income and need some of that stability. And then we also are expecting to try to do some net new affordable by investing in market rate projects with developers who have expressed a willingness to dedicate 10 to 15% of their housing units to affordable in a currently market rate development that they're working on. So like Ari, I think there are things we should ask ourselves, what can we all do about housing? One thing I think Ari touched on is to recognize that Salt Lake County is a really great place to live. There are a lot of opportunities. And because of that, it will continue to attract growth and see that kind of development happening. But what we know, especially in the land use arena, that acknowledging that growth is a challenge is really important, and that we should not underestimate the level of concern and how real and how deeply felt that is in communities that are feeling like their neighborhoods are being invaded by a new development or a change that they really are questioning, will that really impact my quality of life in a negative way? So I think it's really important for all of us to acknowledge that this isn't just a flippant conversation about land use and so forth. This is about quality of life and the values and ideals that we hold really close to our hearts about where we live. I think another thing we can all do is advocate for housing choice and variety, and that's both by building type as well as by accessibility with regard to family income moving into a neighborhood. I think we absolutely have to press for housing jobs balance. Ari mentioned this already, and that trickles into transportation issues. We hear a lot of just build us more lanes, just build more lanes, build more lanes. Well, if we had jobs closer to where you live, you wouldn't need to find those additional lanes of traffic to get to wherever your place of work is. So that's a really critical piece, and it can't just live in the housing world, and it can't just live in the economic development world. It's got to be a joint effort between those two entities. And then, of course, what we believe in, I'm gonna be a little bit biased about regional solutions, because this is not a problem for Mill Creek, where I live, or Midvale, or South Jordan to solve, or Salt Lake City. It's really got to be a regional solution with local entities and local neighborhoods kind of working together to recognize we all play a role or have a piece of that puzzle to solve it. And it's a little easier said than done. I think getting to know your neighborhoods is one of the most important things you can do to be more engaged in your neighborhood, understand the makeup of the neighborhood in terms of housing types. Do you have duplexes tucked away in your neighborhood? You may or may not. I do in Mill Creek. It's really a very common thing to see. And the beauty in that is that, you know, the widow that lived across the street from us when my husband and I moved into our neighborhood, she can stay in this neighborhood. She can age in place when she has housing options that are within a couple of blocks of her single family detached home that she lived in most of her life and raised her children in. So it really does speak to that quality of your community and understanding the makeup of the community in terms of the built environment. And so that's really where Salt Lake County is. I hope I was able to cut a little time off that, Heather, so we can talk. Here's my contact information. If anyone's interested in the kind of programs that Salt Lake County is working on, and the funding that we're seeking from ARPA to sort of support this effort, I'm happy to answer any questions about that, either offline or tonight. Oh, I was 1 minute over. Okay.
You did good. I was impressed. I'm like,
that was fast. That was really fast. Yeah.
So fast.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. And yeah, so I'm not speechless, but I'm like, wow, that covered a good portion of a lot of things. So like I said, we had some heavy hitters for tonight's program, and I am pleased as punch over that. Okay, so while we get, this is the part where you guys get to ask any questions of our local experts, and as you know, they know a lot. So feel free to start typing any questions in, as specific or as general as you would like, and they can be either addressed, if it is like very situation specific, they could be just answered straight in the chat, or we can pull them up to the forefront. We will have a couple questions that were either sent to me privately or prior, and so we can start with those, but feel free to start putting those into the chat and we will get to as many as possible. And if we end early, hooray. So one of the early questions we got was, how long do you think this housing bubble will last, and is it a bubble? And this can go for anyone. This is a free-for-all for any expert.
I guess I'll go first. Short answer is no, it's not a bubble. A bubble is when you have not real demand, and what we have is actually real demand. So, and supply that's not keeping up with demand. So, there's no bubble. If you're waiting for a crash and prices to come down, you're going to be waiting quite a while. And in fact, while you wait, you may just see interest rates rise. So, I don't know that there's any good time to get in or bad time to get in if you're looking for advice. So.
Yeah, Ari's the happy fun guy tonight with that. But I would agree. This is not a bubble. We're not seeing the same characteristics that we see with typical bubbles that you hear about, sort of from an economic point of view. So I don't think it's a bubble at all. And I do think Ari's right. There's got to be something that's being done. I mean, interest rates are going to be slowing things a bit, but it's going to be causing a problem, exacerbating problems in the construction side of things as commercial loans for construction. Those interest rates we don't really want to increase. We want to keep the flow of the housing unit development going. And so it's going to have a sort of a tempering effect on some of the crazy buying and selling that we're seeing. It may even affect the rate at which houses increase in their value, but it's going to have kind of a negative impact, expected to have kind of a negative impact on the other side.
Okay, and I'll just add as a natural follow-up question. If it's not a bubble, then how long do you project that it'll take to work itself out? I know that's like a big predict the future question, but if it's not a bubble and it's not going to pop, how long or when will the supply equal the demand? I guess is a better question.
Well, I think the analysis that we've done in Salt Lake County is all based on Gardner Policy Institute data that's come out in the last 5 or 6 years. And we know that if we can sustain an additional 1,000 units per year being permitted and constructed, and I have to say this is important, permitting a unit doesn't mean that someone can move into it. It's permitting and the construction, and those construction delays are real. So it could be more than 8 years. I think reasonably we're looking at 8 to 10 years before we start to see more equilibrium in the supply and demand.
And do you think housing prices will go down at that point? I'm just trying to guess what people might be asking. So we're basically, this is where the new housing level is.
Yeah, I think you may see over time the rate of increase slow.
Yeah.
But I don't think you're going to see housing prices go down anytime soon.
Yeah, I agree. I think you'll see that start to moderate. And for those of us in a public policy situation, we have to start asking ourselves, then what are we doing about wages? Is it reasonable? If we're seeing that housing and it's going to plateau at that higher level, what are we doing about wages and job opportunities for families, and opportunities, as Ari mentioned, to cut out potentially 30% of their cost of their housing and transportation? So are we doing a really good job of continuing a robust public transit system?
Okay, Mallory, this may be a question for you. I'll conglomerate it into, I'll bigify it. Is it all Californians or insert group that is taking up all of the housing? Like, you can plug in whatever group you want. Like,
Well, Census Bureau data does not let us know that because of delays created by COVID. So we're going to get the new American Community Survey data on Thursday. Get excited. It's really fun. But that only shows 2020. So there's delays in data delivery. I asked my colleague Dayon that works in housing, like, am I missing another data resource that we can look to? And he kind of made me feel like my answer is pretty solid. We've got to wait for the data. We could look at independent moving companies or at Postal Service data, but that only shows part of the picture. So, I mean, broadly speaking, we do get a lot of people moving here from California. We also get a decent number of people moving from Texas. One thing in common between those two states, they're both huge with a lot of people. And so they're going to have more movement of people anyway. If you look, we did a report a couple of years ago looking at data kind of before everything felt extra wild. But the Intermountain West states are also, where a lot of people are coming from when they move to Utah. So we have a lot of movers from Idaho, Colorado, Wyoming, coming into the state. So it's a whole Western thing, I think.
I'll just add, we did a survey of tech employees and asked them, did you grow up here? If not, why did you move here? And what we found was the vast majority of those who moved here from out of state already had some connection to Utah. Either they grew up here and moved away and they're coming back, or they have family here, or something. So these aren't strangers coming to Utah, right? They're our friends and family.
That report that I referenced showed, I think, a quarter of movers in state were born here, actually. So that's kind of a very fun factoid to pull out of your pocket. Not that you need to be connected here to move here. I do want to throw that out. I think we get a lot of benefit from people that are brave enough to come somewhere that they don't know anybody and set up a new life. So.
All right, we have a question. I'll just read it. It's like, if I'm understanding correctly, prices for housing will still be increasing. The last thing I knew was that sellers are asking for more money so that they can sell the house for the best offer. Banks just borrow you the money that the house is valued for. So my question is how long do you think this will still be happening? I hope that answer is clear enough. So let's see if I can try and so it comes down to house values and what the banks will loan for versus what they're selling for, and how long that might continue. That practice might continue. And with the person who wrote that, if I didn't get that right, feel free to add an addendum, and I'll add that in.
So is the question: are the banks going to start wondering whether the house will hold that value and stop lending? Is that?
I'm thinking so.
Yeah, I don't know.
Or the question may be, are we moving slightly back to where we were in 2008 and 2009 when we had we had a lot of poorly capitalized mortgages that had been bundled and sold, derivatives in the market. So I don't think we're going back because there were federal protections put into place after 2009 to sort of keep that riskier lending from happening. I think Ari's touching on probably what the reality is that there's going to get to be some point where the appraisals are no longer holding that increasing value from year to year to year, like we mentioned, that it will likely plateau, but it seems that it's going to likely plateau at that higher level. So that may or may not impact one's ability to get the loan from the bank. Clearly one's revenue, coming in, your income is going to continue to decide who are the folks that are going to get to be in that housing and who are not going to have the opportunity.
Thank you. All right, Ari, I think this question is for you. It says, there was a survey published in January of this year by Envision Utah. It says that more people think growth is going to make the state worse rather than better. And they said 42 to 36%. And similarly, the Utah Foundation published a survey in December of just last year, so just a couple months ago, where more Utahns than not thought that Utah should take action to slow its population growth. It's not just a handful of people with pitchforks, but if we're all looking at the will of the majority, more oppose growth than support it. What actions can policymakers do to limit or slow growth? And so, yeah, it goes into the idea of growth, whether people want it or not, and what to do about the reality of that situation.
Yeah, and I think we have seen in some recent surveys that Utahns are more concerned about growth than we've ever seen them, and understandably so. You see housing prices going up and traffic and so on, and it's a big challenge, right? So yes, we should be concerned about it, and we should be trying to tackle those challenges. As far as what we can do to stop or slow growth, I don't know that there is something we can do other than, we grow because we're a great place to live. So the only thing we really can do is make it not a great place to live. And I'm not sure anybody wants to go there. So I think the best we can do is try to manage the growth in a way that keeps it a great place to live.
And the only other thing that would slow growth is if we didn't have as diversified an economy as we have. I mean, Utah is sort of the victim of its own success. You know, places like Detroit and that have actually shrunk. You know, they've cities in Detroit have figured out how to get, or the cities in Michigan have tried to get smaller. Like we've just been really successful, the state of Utah, in keeping a very diverse economic base, so that if one industry declines, it doesn't pull the whole state economy down with it. So, I mean, that's what you're supposed to do. But I think Ari's right. I don't think anyone would want to push on any of the levers that would slow that growth. I think it's really acknowledging that it's going to happen and that you're not powerless. You're not powerless to shape the way growth impacts you or doesn't impact you. That's what I think is more important for policymakers and from a government entity to say to people that, you know, engaging in as a planning commissioner, like Ari mentioned, engaging in your neighborhood community activities, community councils, things like that, to know what's going on in your communities and understand how they're changing. And if land use applications are coming before your city, are you aware of it? Are you plugged into what's happening in your communities to shape it? Because it's going to come, but we're not powerless to shape it, I think is what I would say from a policy point of view.
And as from a librarian information perspective, a lot of those are actually now available online, like either through like Facebook live streaming or anything. So even if you can't participate post, you can either do comment before or after. And so as a virtual benefit from the last 2 years, there is a lot more access points for accessibility in that engagement. So there is my librarian plug.
Can I add to that?
Yes.
I wish more people would get involved, not just when there's a a housing project being proposed or something, but when there's a general planning effort going on, because that's when we can make the good decisions about growth and where the housing projects ought to go and so forth. And that's when I would like to see people really engage.
Can you elaborate on what a general plan is? I know, but I don't think everyone else does.
So so every city or county is required to have a general plan, and that general plan basically states the community's policy for how they're going to grow. And it'll have a map for where different types of growth are appropriate or not appropriate. Now, the city council doesn't have to follow that general plan when they zone things, but generally it's a good guide for them. So, and I think looking at it holistically at that scale, I think is much more helpful than looking at it project by project.
Awesome, thank you. All right, next question. What kind of impacts on housing and job availability will the new Point of the Mountain development project yield as it replaces the prison? Because that's been a big one that's been coming for multiple years. Is that kind of project the ideal that developing areas may end up striving towards? And that's specifically for people that don't know, that's the Draper area that's being replacing the prison for participants that don't know that.
So maybe I'll take a stab at this since we were involved in some of the early planning for the larger area there. I think as they're planning that, they're headed in the right direction, doing some of the things I talked about with the mixed use. So you have housing and jobs in the same location. I've talked about the 15-minute city, so you can get to everything you need within 15 minutes. And so I think the more we can see those kinds of growth patterns, I think the better things will turn out for everybody. You may not want to live in that kind of place, but because other people do, that reduces the amount of traffic on the roads for you, right? So I think that kind of planning is good.
And I would just add that I think the devil's in the details, because a lot of the 15-minute cities that you see developing have a lot of service sector jobs and office jobs. There's not a lot of manufacturing that's going on, even clean manufacturing that's going on in these communities. So you still have to, figure out that what's missing with regard to the types of jobs that are available in the area. And I will just note to everyone that there was legislation that had a certain affordability set aside in the point that was removed from the bill before it was passed in the few waning hours of the legislative session. So this is where being a community member and getting involved and understanding what's happening, because there was a commitment to put 20% affordable units of all the housing in the point development, and it was removed from legislation before the session passed. So I think there's still the commitment there. Alan Matheson is in charge of that area and the development of that area. And I think he's been a champion of making sure there's really good housing choices. But it was a little bit difficult as a sort of county level policy, coming from the county level in terms of policy, to see that occur at the state level.
I'll just throw out a quick note that in our long-term planning projections, we did account for a couple specific things like plant closures in some of our, extraction dependent areas, but we did use some of the inputs from the point, their assessment and their effort for employment, and then that ended up impacting population. So it is kind of included in our long-term planning projections for Salt Lake and maybe a little bit of Utah County as well.
Awesome, thank you. And this actually would be a question that is potentially applicable for everyone. So do you see that the work from home movement from 2020 through now is impacting the housing market? And I will add, if so, how do you see it impacting the housing market?
I think there are still a lot of unknowns there. I think, we saw kind of this Zoomtown phenomenon where places like Park City and so on, during COVID at least, saw a big boom. And whether that kind of thing sticks at all and to what extent post-COVID, I think remains to be seen. And as I've thought this through, you can combine kind of this ability to telecommute with the future maybe of your car drives itself. And if you're only going to the office one day a week and your car's driving itself when you go, is that going to change where you decide to live? Maybe. And then what implications does that have for our transportation system and so on? These are all complicated questions, and I don't know that we know the answers. My guess is we're going to see two impacts of that, and I think I don't know to what extent, but maybe a little bit. We're going to see people living farther from work. And then we're also going to see some people who say, I don't need to go to work, and so I want to live in a place where I don't have to really go anywhere. I want things close. And so I think you're going to see a little bit of both. You're going to see people who want to live Camas, Oakley, and you're going to see some people who want to live in downtown Salt Lake or Daybreak or something where they can walk everywhere and so forth. But I think the jury's still out. So.
I'll throw out that was the #1 question we got from our reviewers of our long-term planning projections. So we reached out to community stakeholders, different organizations, to get their insights. And especially our more rural communities were asking us how that was included in the projections. And again, kind of what Ari was saying, but kind of touching on a couple, the California movers. We're still waiting on the data. There's a little group of us that are kind of trying to brainstorm how we would even look at the data to assess that in the broader picture. But that's, maybe not directly housing market. We'll leave the data for the housing market specialists to examine, but something on our mind. But yeah, we need more data points before we can kind of assess what that is.
And we don't have a... Go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to add, it's important to keep in mind too that there are a lot of jobs where it's just people aren't going to be working from home. So I wouldn't want to overstate the impact of this.
Yeah, I think that's the one thing I would say is that, so my economic development team reviews, development proposals that are seeking tax increment financing, and we're not seeing a huge slowdown in office development. Even especially in the sort of outside the central business district of Salt Lake City and in the peripheral areas. So I agree with the other panelists, and I think it's a watch and see what's going to happen, because I do think there's, Ari had mentioned something about seeing housing get smaller, but at a time when we're seeing a lot of home offices being developed. So again, just another thing to watch, just to see what's going to play out. I know the county itself, we are reevaluating how we spend time in our office. And many people might realize that the state developed the old former American Express building and have done a very like an open plan. It's a lot of telecommuting even before COVID occurred. So I think we're gonna start seeing it, but it'll probably take a couple years to sort of until we really know what's going on.
And I think it's bigger than just housing too. We saw during COVID, for example, that sales tax receipts in suburban areas went up and downtown they went down. So it could affect everything from where restaurants locate to uh, office floor plans and so forth. But jury's still out, and my gut's telling me it's going to be a little impact, but not huge, at least in the near term.
Well, and to add to that too, you've got curbside pickup might change the way we have curb cutouts in our streets. Like you said, the online sales tax, it's a good thing we started tracking that in 2018, I think it was, wasn't it, Mallory, 2018? It was perfect for us to figure out what was going on during COVID. But I think our behaviors, the pandemic was enough to habituate us to new behaviors, that if it had been shorter period, I think we all would have gone back into our normal way of doing things. So to see whether or not those new habits are going to stick for the long run is part of what I think is going to be really interesting.
Yeah, one other way, sorry, I'm just geeking out over this, but think about the impacts on a retail area, for example, where there are a lot of restaurants. Going forward, do they need as much parking? Probably not. Do they need more curbside pickup? Probably. And does that change how you design a retail or restaurant area? Yeah, absolutely it does.
Yeah, or our health department has gotten more and more requests to license what are called ghost kitchens or phantom kitchens, which are restaurants that have no brick and mortar. They have no place. They're not a food truck either. They just exist on a website. So a beautiful ambiance of food being prepared, but it's all delivered to your home and prepared at a sort of a ghost kitchen, a ghost commercial kitchen that has no seating. That could be really funky as well.
There are tons of possibilities and an exciting future as long as we, take steps to keep eyes on the ball and go with the flow or help shape the flow, I guess is an even better way of saying it. And someone from the chat, Christopher, kindly pointed to the general plan for Salt Lake County. So there's a link there for the west side of Salt Lake County, which will be an awesome place to start for looking at. I think we have time for a couple more questions before we do wrap-up thoughts. And so, Dina, briefly, could you talk about the federal housing expiration? In your presentation, you mentioned what is that? Like, how does housing expire? What is it and what does it mean?
Yeah, so what it means is when a development comes in, either a nonprofit developer or a for-profit developer that's seeking low-income housing tax credits, and those are allocated to each state based on population. So I believe we're going to be getting more tax credits to allocate. It's an application process. Developers put in an application, request the low-income housing tax credits that they can then syndicate or sell to banks to help finance a low-income housing tax credit project, which means that the units that are developed are deed restricted for a certain period of time, meaning those rents can't go up, beyond a certain amount. And so it's a real protection for lower income people, especially deeply affordable units, folks that are making less than 30% of the area median income to 50% of the area median income. So it's a protection. It's a way of saying, this is critical housing element for us. We want to keep it. Once that expiration, that sort of affordability period ends, like the next day, that's a little exaggeration, but pretty much the next day, that landowner can raise those prices to a market rate. And it makes everyone ask, okay, well then what happens to the folks that have been living in these units? Can they find another unit that's affordable somewhere else in the city? It's an incredibly disruptive process for low and moderate income families to go through. So that's the affordability period. When they expire, that's what it means. So there's an effort. You can come in and sort of continue the affordability period and extend that expiration date, but it requires a pretty hefty capital investment to make that happen. And at a time like we're seeing now with the escalation of rents, you would, if you're a landowner and you're looking at that time horizon and saying, oh, I'm going to be really lucky, I'm going to be able to raise my rents and make a lot more money than I was in the past. But at what kind of impact to the families? I mean, it's pretty traumatic.
All right,
I hope that
thank you.
answers the question.
Yeah, that was pretty good. At least, so I think there's one question that came in to me, and it's something referring to as the missing middle. Do you like what is quote unquote the missing middle, and how can that help housing?
Well, the county we just hosted a missing middle. Our regional solutions event last fall was missing middle. And this is real. I'm glad somebody asked this question because this is what it's not. It's not an affordability measure. It's a building type. So Dan Paralek is the person who wrote the best book on missing middle housing. And it looks at really sort of 9 or 10 units, between kind of a single family home and maybe a 20 unit apartment building. It's a duplex, a fourplex, a sixplex. It's the kind of urban form that is more likely to fit into an area just adjacent to a single family residential, but isn't quite the 15-story apartment building. It's the ones that are less intrusive and less sort of invasive to single family residential communities that can help bring density and more housing opportunity and options to neighborhoods.
I'll add that the work that we do at Gardner, we also do these small area estimates throughout the decade. And I live in the census tract that was the fastest growing because it includes a bunch of giant apartment buildings and then a lot of these new townhomes that are coming in. So there's maybe a big lot, there's a lot next to me that's going to be redeveloped into, I think, 12 units of townhomes. And that's happening all over the sides of the block. So as a millennial in a townhome in Salt Lake, I'm appreciative for those missing middle units.
Thank you. And it was actually just raised to my attention. I apologize. There were some questions being answered in the Q&A section that I was unaware of. So we're going to get that one in really fast if we can go just a little bit over time. It's a specific, it's a specific situation, but I'm going to broaden it into a general. So let's see. Someone like living in an affordable housing, the taxes go up and so does rent. So if a person's income actually decreases, are the issues being presented tonight about growth and everything else, is that part of the reason why taxes will go up, but along with rent? Is that part of what's causing this issue of affordability?
Yeah, that can be one of the elements with regard to property taxes. I mean, the interdependent nature of real estate is that if I live next door to Ari or Mallory and they invest in their property, my property value is going to go up without me paying any money to increase its value. So I'm probably going to experience I could potentially experience a tax increase. It's not guaranteed though, because of the way property taxes, the certified tax rates are managed in the county. So it can impact it, absolutely. And it's a really good question about how does property tax policy come into play with regard to affordability? And it's definitely something at the county that we've been looking at and trying to understand a little bit more completely.
Awesome, thank you. And then there's another link on missing middle housing, so in the chat. So if you are there, we can look at that. And we are sadly out of time. So many good questions and so much good insight. Do you guys, I'll leave it up to you before we close. Is there any closing thoughts or things that you want someone really to take away from this presentation as we look at the projection of growth that is coming to our wonderful state because we are a fantastic place to live? Like, what would you like people to take away from as we end this tonight?
I would say stay engaged. You've shown up on a Tuesday night to listen to 3 people talk about housing and explore options. And I would say stay engaged. It's the best thing you can possibly do, and hold policymakers accountable for, for what's needed in the community.
I'll go next. I'll just say that our long-term planning projections are one version of the future. And so, anything could change that. And so I think staying engaged, decisions can change what that outlook looks like. So.
And I think I just want to emphasize a sense of optimism. Um, I think Dina put it well. We do have a lot of power to shape the future. I don't know that we can stop the growth. There's no door that you can close, and people are going to stop coming, right? But as long as we're a great place, we're going to grow. But there are lots of great decisions we can make to make that turn out well, and we can make our future. We don't have to let it make us.
Well said. Thank you, all of you. Thank you for coming tonight, for all of our participants. You are what make Let's Be Neighbors possible. And I hope you guys all have a wonderful evening and look forward to our next one coming in actually just a couple weeks and in April. But thank you for being part of our housing and being part of the solutions. Have a good night, everybody.